Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Western Civilization 1, where we attempt to pull back the mists of history and illuminate the past. Today, we're going to be continuing on with the Roman Republic, and we're going to be looking at changes in Roman society. Our focus question for today will be, during the Middle Republic, society became more stratified, i.e. economically unequal. How and why did this happen? Okay, so grab a pen and paper, grab a keyboard, and we'll get underway. Now, last time we had talked about the Punic Wars, and during the Punic Wars, we saw that Rome was in a fight for its life against Hannibal and the Carthaginians, and that they had ultimately come out on top. But really, that was just the beginning of Roman power in the 1 and 200s BC, because Rome continued to grow over these decades, before soon stretching across 3 different continents. Now, I want to get some terms down, some terms that will help you to understand what's going on here. One of the terms is Roman Imperium. The word imperium in Latin just means to command. So we've touched upon this term already, and we touched upon it in the context of when a community would surrender to Rome. Back in the old days, one of their neighbors would surrender to them, and Rome would become like the alpha of the pack. That community would have to abide by Rome's foreign policy, become an ally, so on and so forth. And so when a community surrendered, Rome had an imperium over that community. They're expected to obey the commands of Rome. And so, of course, this term would become the root and the foundation for the term empire. Okay? Now, we're not quite there yet, not strictly speaking, but we're getting there. So, generally what would happen is the Romans would send out a magistrate, because magistrates, these are consuls, praetors, and the like, they're invested with imperium, the ability to command on the field, because they're commanders. And so I want to talk about a second term that will be useful here, and this is the term provincia. And of course, this is where we're going to get the English word province, which is kind of like a state, as in like the United States state. All right, you may be familiar with the example of Canada. Canada has provinces. Well, if we're going to understand the term in its Roman context, we have to understand its Latin roots. I apologize for all the Latin terminology, but I think it'll help us to understand. Originally, when a magistrate, whether it was a consul or whether he was a praetor, when he was given command, he was oftentimes given command in a particular area. So for instance, if he was on campaign, a military campaign, he would be given concern over a particular area. Now, the word in Latin for concern over something is provincia, or province in English. As a matter of fact, we can still use it in that sense, even in English, okay? Now, it didn't have to be in a military sense. In other words, praetors were also judges. So sometimes they'd be sent abroad to fight, but sometimes they'd spend their time at home giving decisions out, in which case lawsuits might be their particular province. That was what their job was. But usually it was military. Provincia was usually used in a military sense. They would be given a theater of operation, okay? A place where they were going to be fighting. Now, in time, Rome's provinces became permanent. And let me explain this. Originally, Rome saw itself as just one city-state among many, and we saw this with the Italians. So they would force one to surrender, and that city-state more or less was left to its own devices. They elected their own leaders, they did their own thing. Rome only asked them for loyalty and military contribution. And that worked in Italy pretty well because, well, Italy is not that big. And so it was easy for Rome to keep an eye on its allies. But now the Roman Empire extended over 3 different continents. It was thousands of miles long now. And it became very, very difficult to supervise places that were far away and would take months to get to. And so soon the Romans began to assign magistrates provincia over particular territories. And the first example, the first place that they had to do this was in Sicily. And if you're not familiar with Sicily, Sicily is right over here. It's off the coast of Rome, in Sardinia. These were early territories that were won from the Carthaginians. And it soon became obvious that Rome wasn't going to be able to supervise these territories from so far away. And so they would station a praetor, one of the top magistrates, there on an almost permanent basis so that he could supervise. Well, the problem is as the empire began to grow, they didn't have enough praetors. There were only 2 of them. And so they started to expand the number of praetors, or we can even call them governors at this point, because they're now beginning to govern. And it went from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. Anyways, the number of governors grew. And Rome, it was a little bit of a problem for Rome to now govern its particular areas. And so when a governor would get to a place, he would, first and foremost be concerned with military stability in the area. He would also have to regulate the relationships among the various cities of that particular locality. And he was now kind of the law there. And so he would hear cases and dispense with justice. Well, this caused new problems for Rome because all of these governors and troops that were out there now needed to be funded. It was pretty cheap the old way, where you just let the city do its own thing, and as long as they contributed troops when you needed them, that was a cheap way to run things. But now this was getting more costly to station governors and their staff and all the soldiers that were going to have to be kept there on a permanent basis. Now, Rome was not particularly sophisticated. They didn't have a bureaucracy at this point. And so they tended to farm out taxes to tax farmers. That was a thing. How does that work? Well, essentially, if you were rich, you would bid on a contract. You'd say, well, Sicily, I think Sicily is probably worth so many millions of pounds of gold. Probably that's too much, but hundreds or thousands of pounds of gold. And so I will give the government money so that they can finance their operations there, but in return, I will be allowed to collect taxes on behalf of the government. And so I can make my money back and hopefully turn a profit. Well, as you can imagine, this was open to some abuse, and these tax farmers, or as the Romans would call them, let me write it down, publicani, were, it's Publicani if you can't read it, publicani were not the most well-liked people in the provinces. Many of them grew very fat and very rich off of what the locals would have seen as abuse of power and corruption. Well, things were changing in Italy as well. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, Roman military service was done on a voluntary basis. That is, people would get drafted into the military, they would serve, and didn't really receive pay for that. Later on, the Romans conceded that they needed to give people a little bit to live off of, but it really wasn't a professional army. It was a volunteer army of sorts. And this was fine as long as Rome was fighting its immediate neighbors. You would try to live off the land as much as possible, plunder the foreign cities, and then hopefully be back home by the time it was time to plant. 2 months maximum, and then you were done with your service. This began to change as Rome began to fight professional armies. As Rome fought kings who had their own professional armies, these armies could stay in the field longer, and so if the Romans wanted to be successful, they would have to stay in the field longer. Also, the Romans were fighting wars further and further away now. And so it was really inconceivable that you were going to only spend a month or two in the service. 6 years became more like it. And it wasn't only during wartime that this would happen. As Rome acquired more and more provinces, it needed to keep permanent troops stationed for longer and longer periods of time. So that during the Middle Republic, even during peacetime, something like 120,000 men were under arms, and that was at peace. Well, this put an immense strain on the Roman system. Remember, soldiers are small farmers, and warfare and service really interrupted their lives. For one, during the Punic Wars, that was the wars against Hannibal and Carthage, the Roman countryside was devastated. Remember, Hannibal was in Italy for 17 years, and during that time he was living off the land and he was devastating things. So many farmers suffered greatly during that time. Also, since most Roman soldiers were farmers, now that they were spending many years of their adult life away, many of them started to lose their farms. And so the small farmer, which was the backbone of the Roman army, began to lose his land. And as they lost their land and were forced to sell, what ended up replacing them were what the Romans called latifundia. And I think I should write that word down. So let me see here. Latifundia. Latifundia. Latifundia were large Roman plantations. They were made up of these small farms that had been bought out, and wealthy landlords would purchase these farms, consolidate them, usually grow some sort of a cash crop, something that they could make money off of. And rather than hiring back the peasants that had been displaced, they now found it much cheaper to resort to slave labor. One of the consequences of Rome acquiring this big empire were many, many prisoners of war who became slaves on these large latifundia. And so the number of slaves in Rome began to grow very precipitously during this time. It's estimated that by the end of the Republic, about 40% of Romans might have been in chains. Well, what happened to the small farmers? Well, many of them went to Rome. It's during this time that the population of Rome began to swell and would eventually reach over 1 million people. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot for them to do in Rome except to be poor and to swell out the slums that were hastily built to accommodate all of these new people. And these former farmers, now turned slum dwellers, to be a pretty rowdy element in Rome. The Roman mob became the thing of legends. These people would mill about and miserable and hungry and cause all kinds of trouble. So much so that the Romans eventually began to provide free bread and entertainment, which they call bread and circus, for these people to keep them occupied. Well, all wasn't bad in Italy, though, because at the top, the Roman nobility was thriving. Rome was quickly becoming a plutocracy. And that's a fancy word that means a society ruled by wealth. We've seen class problems in Rome before. We talked about the patricians versus the plebes. The patrician-plebe divide was based off of birth, not so much wealth, although that was a factor. But unlike this earlier divide, this was a purely wealth phenomena. This was a wealthy elite, and it was an elite in which status mattered a lot. And this was fueled in large part by the empire. The empire had brought unprecedented opportunities to people. War brought back all sorts of plunder for the victorious, gold and silver and art and all sorts of valuables. Also, as Rome acquired more territories, the wealthy were able to acquire these large estates. Rome acquired many natural resources like mines, which produce silver and gold and other precious metals. Governorships, as I mentioned, were highly lucrative because there was very little oversight of you, and so many people came back much richer after being a governor. Tax farming and military contracts, you name it, there were plenty of opportunities in Rome at this time. Now, aside from wealth, honor was incredibly important to the Roman nobility. Each one tried to outdo each other in the amount of lavish displays in honor that they could acquire for themselves. They would compete for the different offices in government. It became very competitive. Glory in battle was the ultimate. To be a victorious general was the ultimate. Not only did it bring cash rewards as you plundered, but it might entitle you to a triumph, which is pictured here. Triumphs were these gigantic military parades where you would get to show off all the plunder, the vanquished kings, and you would kind of be like a king for a day, and these were highly coveted. Other wealthy nobles put on games, gladiatorial spectacles, chariot races, shows, dramatic shows. They built monuments and temples, and all in a bid to outdo each other. And of course, this helped your career out, being known as a wealthy, powerful, generous patron. And so that brings us to my next point, the patron-client relationship, which had been a part of Roman society really from the beginning. Wealthy Romans acted as patrons. And basically what a patron was a wealthy individual. The word is still used today, by the way. It's a wealthy individual who gives gifts to poor clients. So the way it would work is daily, the poor would line up at the houses of their wealthy patrons. The patron would be seated as shown here. And the poor would come and literally kiss the ring. Say, Ave patron, hail patron. And you would dispense little gifts and little rewards to them, and they would give you honor in return. They were also expected to give you loyalty. That is, when you were running for office, Rome was still a democracy of sorts. You still had to run for office. Your clients were expected to turn out in big numbers to help support you. And so it became very, very important if you wanted to move up the political ladder to not only be known as a great person because of your exploits, but to have a big client base so that they could pack out the voting arena and vote for you. Of course, the ultimate goal was to one day sit in the Senate, which all high office holders were allowed to do. And it's during this time that the Senate began to acquire more and more power. Now, technically, the Senate was only an advisory body. They didn't really have an important place in government, at least from an institutional level. They just gave opinions. But the prestige of the Senate at this time was so high that their opinions almost always became law. And the Senate was so powerful that they would direct consuls and they would direct praetors. They would assign the different provinces to them. And even tribunes. You may remember tribunes. They were supposed to be protecting the plebes. Even they were bought out during this period because they wanted to advance and become part of the old boys club too. And so there was very little stopping the Senate at this time. They took control of foreign affairs, met with diplomats. They really became the primary organ in the Roman government. And because they controlled so much of the wealth of the empire, the public lands that were acquired from defeated enemies, war, and the plunder that was acquired through it, because they issued the contracts to the publicani and other businessmen, the Roman Senate really became more like an oligarchy. You may remember oligarchy is ruled by the few. And so Rome began to lose a lot of its democratic character during this time, a lot of its republican character, and it became really tightly controlled in the hands of the Senate. All right. Well, what I'd like you to do is focus on this. During the Middle Republic, society became much more stratified. How and why did this happen? If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to this channel. If you liked this video, you might also want to give it a thumbs up or leave a comment. Thank you, and I will see you again for our next lecture.